Welcome to the NYU Law Forum. So we are lucky today to be joined by three experts on economic policy and to give us a perspective on the Trump administration's economic agenda and how Congress might be reacting to that, and of course the substance of the agenda itself. All three of the panelists have advised administrations and presidents, and so we are lucky to have them. So introducing in alphabetical order, Lily Batchelder is, of course, a member of our community and professor of law and public policy here at NYU. From 2010 to 2015, Lily was on leave working for President Obama's administration, serving as deputy at the National Economic Council. And before that, she served as chief tax counsel at the Senate Finance Committee. To my left is Diana Furchtgott-Roth. Diana is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, director of the Economics 21 program, and a columnist for both MarketWatch and Tax Notes. Diana served on the transition team for President Trump, and she has a significant record of service in government. During the George W. Bush administration, she was chief economist of the U.S. Department of Labor, and before that, chief of staff at the Council of Economic Advisors, a return there since she had started her career in government on the staff of President Reagan's CEA. Under President George H.W. Bush, Diana also served as Deputy Executive Director of the White House Domestic Policy Council and Associate Director of the Office of Policy Planning. Finally, on the furthest to the left is Jason Furman. Jason is Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Until this past January, he served as the top economic advisor to President Barack Obama during in his second term, serving there as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Before that, in the first term, he served as deputy director of the National Economic Council, and Jason was there and involved in most of the consequential economic decisions that were made during the Obama administration. Before that, Jason had served in the National Economic Council in the Clinton administration and also worked at the World Bank. So again, we are lucky to have a panel like this today to comment on the economic agenda looking forward. So I thought the way that we might try to organize our conversation, but we'll just sort of also let it go where it goes, is to reflect on what President Trump said in his speech last night before the joint session of Congress. In that speech, President Trump laid out a diagnosis for the economy, as well as a number of policies that he is pushing and that he says will be solutions to some of the problems that he has identified. So the way I thought we might start off is by talking about Trump's diagnosis of the economy. And so what I will do is I'm just going to actually quote a short section from the speech last night where Trump was diagnosing the ills of the economy according to him. And then I thought I would have each of our panelists react to that, and then we can go from there as we begin to talk about some of the solutions that he has proposed. So President Trump last night said about the economy, 94 million Americans are out of the labor force. Over 43 million people are now living in poverty, and over 43 million Americans are on food stamps. More than 1 in 5 in their prime working years are not working. We have the worst financial recovery in 65 years. In the last 8 years, the past administration has put on more new debt than nearly all other presidents combined. We've lost more than 1/4 of our manufacturing jobs since NAFTA was approved, and we've lost 60,000 factories since China joined the WTO. Our trade deficit in goods with the world last year was nearly $800 billion. So curious for your reactions, and to the degree you disagree with that diagnosis, how you would diagnose the economy. And we'll go in alphabetical order for this one, and so start off with Lily.
Sure. Well, first, thanks to the organizers for organizing this panel. And, I thought in general that Trump's address was a shift in tone, perhaps, and a sense of optimism from at least his inaugural address. In terms of policy proposals and perhaps diagnosis, it didn't seem to be all that different from what he said before. The diagnosis of the economy, I would tend to disagree with the overarching characterization. I think if you, of course, it depends on what period you're comparing things over, but if you looked back to the financial recession, and where we are today, we've had a quite dramatic decline in the unemployment rate. We've seen millions of people gain health insurance. And so, I think we're actually on a very positive trajectory over the past, say, 8 years since the financial crisis. That's not to say there aren't major challenges remaining in the economy, and there is a poverty rate that's way too high, and stagnating wages, and a lot of things that continue to need to be addressed. But I think the sort of characterization that everything has gone to hell and is on a downward trajectory is far too simplistic.
Diana?
Well, first of all, thank all of you. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. It's great to come to New York and be here with all of you, and I'm especially looking forward to your questions. So as to David's question, there has been a very slow rate of GDP growth compared with other recessions. Last quarter, GDP grew at about 1.9%. GDP growth has been around 2%, not really above 2% for any of the years of the recovery. That is very unusual. The other side will say, well, it's because we had such a bad crisis. The financial crisis was such a sharp downturn that it takes longer to recover. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. But we have seen this declining labor force participation rate. Usually after recoveries, the labor force participation rate goes down and then it goes up again. Ours has not really gone up again. We have labor force participation rates, which is the share of people who are either working or looking for work, that's comparable to the late 70s, before the decade that millions of women moved into the labor force. And it's not that people are retiring, because the labor force participation rate for 55 and over has actually increased. What we're really concerned about is the 25 to 54 group. Not all of you, because you're in law school, but people who are not in school, who are not working, and it's a core group that is generally supposed to be working. And it's interesting if you compare the data with that of the UK, where I'm originally from. And you can see in the UK since 2009, for men and women, labor force participation rates have gone up steadily. And for the United States, they have gone down. And this is very troubling. And a broader measure of the unemployment rate that the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses, and we're going to have more data next week, the U6, the most comprehensive measure, puts the unemployment rate at around 9.4%. So with slow GDP growth, low labor force participation, we need to be doing better. And that's why Donald Trump won the election, because millions of Americans thought that they could be doing better. They wanted to see their incomes grow faster. They were seeing their kids not getting jobs, still living in their parents' basements with high student loans, and they thought they wanted a change. They didn't want 4 more years of the same.
Jason?
So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. And I feel it's unfair that David came and didn't get an introduction. I remember 8 years ago, him toiling away, being one of just the very central people in putting together President Obama's initial set of economic plans. I watched the president's inaugural address a month and a half ago with my children. And after it, I turned to my 9-year-old son and to my daughter and said, I thought the president painted way too negative a picture of our country and our country falling apart. And my 9-year-old son said, but Daddy, you always told me that's what things were like when you started. And, why can't he be telling the truth too? And so I had to think about it. And I find myself, I actually, will confess, I don't want to triangulate Lily, apologies. I agree with a lot of what Lily said, and I agree with a lot of what Diana said, and then I think the question is what the diagnosis is. Labor force participation, the 94 million number is just an embarrassment to use. 40 million of those are young students or people over the age of 75, and if your economic vision is that all 40 million of those people should be working, it's a little bit foolish, and it's not even a very wise thing to do, because that 94 million number will go up. No matter how well the economy does, just because of the demographic structure, it will go up. So if that's your benchmark for economic success, you didn't pick very well. But the problem of declining labor force participation in our economy is a really serious one. In the case of prime-age men between 25 and 54, 12% of them are not participating in the workforce. In the 1950s, it was 2% of them not participating in the workforce. And you look from the 1950s through 2015, it basically was a straight line down. That was true during all the administrations Diana worked for two President Bushes and President Reagan. It was true for all the administrations I worked for President Clinton and President Obama. What's striking is that decline has been much faster and much further than what you've seen in European countries. So France, we wouldn't want to emulate France's labor market regulation, but even with all their terrible labor market regulation, they actually have a higher fraction of their population working than we do here in the United States. So I think taking that seriously, being worried about that, but it has some implications that you need to think about. It doesn't mean like it was all caused by the Affordable Care Act or something like that. The Affordable Care Act may be good or bad, but it certainly didn't cause anything that happened from the year 1955 through the year 2010, and you saw the decline over that period too. GDP growth, I also think, is too low. Absolutely. Again, a little bit of international perspective helps. The productivity growth rate has fallen everywhere among the advanced economies, 31 out of 32 advanced economies. It's higher in the United States than it is in any of the other G7 economies. And that's actually surprising because we're ahead of them technologically, which means they should be catching up. Instead, we're pulling further ahead. But that's certainly not good enough, and we can talk about that in the policy part. The biggest difference between our growth rate, though, isn't productivity now and in the past, isn't productivity, and it isn't the wake of the financial crisis, although both of those matter. It's just demography. In the 1980s, the share of the population 25 to 54 was growing at over 2% a year. Now that part of the population is falling. So you had 2% added to your growth rate every year because that population was growing. Now you have that same group subtracting from growth. That is the function of choices made about fertility decades ago. It has nothing to do with Obama or anyone else. So I think some of this diagnosis is right. I think the participation issue is very serious. The productivity issue, is very serious. But I think to think this all happened in the last 5 years or was caused by the Affordable Care Act is foolish.
Since there seems to be actually some commonality in at least some parts of the diagnosis, as Jason said. So I'm curious, before we dive into some of the specific policy areas that Trump raised last night, I'm curious what the panel thinks are the prime tools that the government has at its disposal to address issues of labor force participation and productivity, and then how does that align with what President Trump discussed last night? And so I guess I kick off. Maybe I'll move down the line. Diana, if you'd like to give initial thoughts.
Well, there are so many things that we could be doing to increase labor force participation I'm talking about the core group that we're concerned about, which is 25 to 54. We know that young people are going to want to get more education, and we know that older people at some point are going to want to retire, so they have a somewhat different set of incentives. But we need to look at, and I know all of you are lawyers, but I'm an economist, so I tend to think of things in terms of labor supply and labor demand. So in terms of labor supply, we need to make sure that people get a better education, that they're equipped to deal with the jobs of the 21st century. It used to be in 2001 when I was chief of staff of the Council of Economic Advisors. I was the first chief of staff to order smartphones for my staff. No one had had them before, and they got BlackBerries, and they were very happy with them. And now, and it was a big perk. Now you can walk around and everybody has one of these smartphones. But it also means that the educational level for dealing with tasks such as working in construction, working in logging, you need a higher level of education. And we need to be improving the quality of schools, consigning children to a school where there's a 55% graduation rate. I would agree with Donald Trump and say this is a major, major problem. We need to have more school choice, more competition in schools. In New York, there are many different, there's active charter schools, there's Catholic schools, there's many different kinds of schools, but in other cities, it's not always true. So we need to be raising the level of schools. We need to be getting people more prepared, A, to enter the labor market, and B, to change jobs once they are in the labor market. Because these BLS projections of what jobs are going to be there later on, none of them really pan out. We don't know what jobs are going to be like in the 2020s, the 2030s, the 2040s. So people have to be prepared to turn on a dime and have enough innate human capital to be able to do on-the-job learning. So for example, when I was at Swarthmore College, I took courses in programming in Fortran. I was really good at doing these do loops and programming in Fortran. Nowadays, there's no need to program in Fortran. That skill is completely useless. But the ability to think, to analyze text, to write, to learn other things, that still stood me in very good stead. Looking at the labor demand aside, so we need to know, we need to encourage companies to come here to the United States and create jobs. There's no reason we should have the highest corporate tax rate in the world at around 39% when the OECD average is 25%. It doesn't make sense. It's because other countries, for other countries, it's much easier to lower their corporate tax rates. So Britain has decided that in 2020, its corporate tax rate is going to be 17%, down from 20%. It didn't have to go through revenue estimates. It didn't have to prove that 17% is going to be revenue neutral. The Chancellor of the Exchequer can just stand up on budget day in March and say the corporate tax rate is going down to 17% when it's March 2020. We have a lot harder time in doing that. We have to jump through hoops, and some of that is good. We don't want the government to be spending too much, even though it has been spending a lot over the past, not just 8 years, but past 16 years. We can see that our debt and deficits have been steadily rising. So we do want to have constraints on what the government can do. But the process has meant that we are far behind in terms of corporate tax rates, which means that our companies are frequently, some of them are inverting to have another, be taxed by another country. Burger King, for example, is now owned by Tim Hortons, the donut chain in Canada, because it wants to be under the Canadian tax regime. Pharmaceutical companies want to be owned by companies in Ireland. So we need to have incentives to bring these corporations back. There's about $2 trillion in earnings that our companies have offshore, because not only do we have the highest corporate tax rate, but we also tax companies on their worldwide earnings, and only about 7 countries do that. So we tax earnings abroad also. We also need to reform regulations to make it easier for companies to come back and locate here. So the Keystone XL pipeline, for example, that Donald Trump just approved, as all of you know, it was years and years in being approved. In Canada, if a pipeline is not explicitly approved or disapproved within a year, I believe that it automatically goes forward. So regulations that are simpler in other countries, including environmental regulations, discourage our companies from locating here. So there's many things that we could be doing. And I hope that President Trump is going, and together with Congress, is going to start moving towards doing some of these things.
So before turning it over to Jason to talk about what he thinks are some of like the main levers that you could use to address some of the problems that both he and Diana diagnosed and how that compares to Trump, I wanted to quickly read what Trump said both about tax cuts and tax reform and regulation last night, since Diana raised it, and it seems like it should be a topic that we discuss here to figure out how it aligns with the diagnosis. So on tax cuts and reform, Trump said, "My economic team is developing historic tax reform that will reduce the tax rate on our companies so that they can compete and thrive anywhere and with anyone. At the same time, we will provide massive tax relief for the middle class." When it came to regulation, Trump said, "We have undertaken a historic effort to massively reduce job-crushing regulations, creating a deregulation task force inside of every government agency, imposing a new rule which mandates that for every one new regulation, too old regulations must be eliminated. And though he didn't, I think, discuss it last night, they've obviously been pushing for repeal of Dodd-Frank as well on the financial side. So
That has to be done by much of that has to be done by legislation.
True.
You can't just repeal Dodd-Frank on your own, without Congress.
yes, so for those who are in the legislative and regulatory state class, it's an important lesson.
So there are some things that the executive branch can do on its own and others that it needs Congress for.
So turning it over to Jason to both react to that and also to lay out how, whatever
Right.
your vision of solutions.
I mean, and I agreed with a lot of what Diana had to say, and there's a long list of other things in terms of public investment in infrastructure, expanding international trade, making investments in training and apprenticeship programs and job search programs that help people, something we barely try to do in this country at this point in time, and then ultimately accepting that the distribution our economy produces may not be the one we want, and that we have to redress some imbalances of bargaining power through a higher minimum wage, through stronger unions, and through a more progressive tax system. You know, I confess that and I'm sure I left things out, but this isn't my State of the Union. Actually, the biggest thing economically that we could do to expand our productivity growth in this country, expand our GDP growth in this country, is reform our immigration system. And when the Congressional Budget Office looked at the bipartisan proposal that passed a couple of years ago, they said it would add 2.3% to the size of our economy, which is larger than any other economic policy I've ever seen quantified by the CBO or any other nonpartisan or academic accounting for something. And you got that both from the extra workers that you got from immigration reform and also from the extra productivity you would get from reform. And that's sadly an area where I think this administration, rather than taking the opportunity to add to growth, will be subtracting from growth. That might be the least of the problems with it, and we won't talk about the
Donald
others.
Trump did actually call for immigration reform last night, and he called for a model based on Australia and Canada, for the point system.
Like happy
I'm
to
not sure if
turn
you
this
saw his
into
address.
to a food fight debate.
No, it's
I
not a
don't
food
think-
fight
I don't think
debate.
calling
It's
out-
a factual statement.
I think when immigrants commit crimes at a lower rate, setting up an office to list every single time any immigrant in this country commits a crime is not the way to get yourself forward on immigration reform. There are many people. Jeb Bush was very in favor of immigration reform. He lost to somebody in the primaries who was very against immigration reform, in part because of that. Somebody's carried that into the White House. I don't think anyone would doubt that. But anyway, in terms of
stick to the facts as to what, if we're talking about Donald Trump's address last night, we should just have it on the record that he did call for immigration reform, specifically mentioning the systems in Canada and Australia.
Okay, so turning it back to Jason.
Okay. The regulation's a little trickier, because regulation is very much an issue-by-issue thing. It doesn't make sense to say you want more regulation. It doesn't make sense to say you want less regulation. It makes sense to take any given regulation and look at it on a cost-benefit basis. For most regulations, those costs are on businesses. For most regulations, the benefits are for society as a whole, whether it is a life saved from an environmental regulation or someone's safety from a safety regulation. And so the statement that reducing regulation will reduce costs for businesses, I think, is absolutely true. I don't know the magnitude of that cost reduction, but I think that has the sign right. Whether that's the right thing for us as a country is a different story. And you look at something that Lily did a lot of work on, the conflict of interest rule or fiduciary rule for retirement savings. That's a perfect example. It's a rule that reduced the ability of brokers to put people into costly, inefficient, and bad investments and get a kickback in exchange for doing it. By ending that practice, you will reduce the profits for those brokers. You will have a set of costs for society in the form of increased paperwork and the like, and you'll have people in investments that are significantly less misallocated than the investments they were in before. In our judgment, that passed a cost-benefit test. If you got rid of it, you would reduce costs on some businesses. You wouldn't necessarily make the country a better place. In terms of the magnitude, though, Diana mentioned two things. One was education, one was regulation. And I'd ask you to look at California's economic development over the last 50 years and Alabama's economic development over the last 50 years. One of those places did really well in terms of education and investing in education. And California has tons of regulations, many of them quite ridiculous and absurd. Alabama is a very, very lightly regulated place. It is a much easier place to do business in than California. But it doesn't have a university like Stanford in Alabama. And so if you ask me if I had to choose between one of those two and what it means for our economic future, I would choose Stanford plus a lot of really dumb regulations than the opposite. That's, again, not to say I wouldn't rather have Stanford plus smart regulations to Stanford plus dumb regulations, but just quantifying the relative importance of these for our economic trajectory. I don't think there's a comparison.
Sure. So maybe just sort of, we've had a far-ranging discussion, go back to some of the core issues that David had raised about labor force participation and productivity. A couple things to add. I think first on labor force participation, one sort of interesting phenomena is the decline in female labor force participation among prime-age women in the U.S. And there was, a huge increase over the course of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then there's been a slight dip, while other countries that are comparable in their economic development, it's continued to rise. So we've been a bit of an outlier in that respect. And I think that's a place where Trump has perhaps correctly diagnosed the problem, but not correctly diagnosed the solution, in my view. So I think we could really make a difference on female labor force participation if we start helping address the huge cost of childcare and deal with paid leave, start offering paid leave. We're one of, I think, like 3 countries in the world that don't have paid leave.
I think it's now down
two,
to 1 or
okay.
2. Since the UAE.
Just for the record, in his address last night, Donald Trump did call for paid leave.
Yes, I was about to talk about that. So I think he's correctly raised this as an issue. What I disagree with is his ways of addressing the problem. So on childcare, he has a set of proposals, primarily through the tax system, that are under 2% of the cost of his overall tax plan. He is saying that he's going to offer a new tax plan, so I'm just going on what he put out during the campaign. And they're primarily tilted towards higher income earners. So if you look at childcare costs as a share of earnings, they are much, much higher for lower income, primarily women, but obviously it's also men who bear the cost of childcare. So if you're really interested in increasing labor force participation, especially among women, then I think it would be great to help with the cost of childcare, especially among those for whom it eats up a huge share of their budget, and that's the lower income group. And his proposals, I think about 5% of the value goes to the little over third of families that earn under $50,000. So I think there, again, he's talking about the issue, which I really applaud him for, but I wish he would reconfigure his proposals to address where they'd have the most bang for the buck. Similarly, on the paid leave proposal, which I'm less familiar with, it's unusual in that, for example, it excludes fathers, adoptive parents, foster parents. There's a lot more I think we should be doing on paid leave than what he's actually proposing. Another labor force participation issue is, of course, male labor force participation. And there, one proposal that I think is really worth looking at that I don't think the president has mentioned, but certainly Paul Ryan has discussed, is expanding the earned income tax credit for, I guess, childless workers or people who are not custodial parents. This is the one group that is actually taxed into poverty currently, and the EITC does not apply to young adults, where if you're interested in getting, boosting labor force participation, now shifting to a primarily male focus, a lot of it is getting people into the labor force early on in their careers. And so if you could expand the EITC and include young adults, I think that could be another very valuable proposal. On productivity, Diana had mentioned education, of course. We may have some different views about how to retool education. I might focus a little more on college access, but education is always going to be key to productivity. I agree with Jason on immigration reform. In general, just investing in children, and especially children from disadvantaged backgrounds, has huge long-term effects on their earnings, on their health outcomes, on their test scores, on their any like positive socioeconomic indicator you can think of. So, so that would both, you know, if really investing in childcare or doing universal pre-K would be very beneficial in terms of long-term productivity growth. You could also do things like expand the child tax credit for the youngest children who are low income. There's a really interesting CEA report on licensing. That's sort of another area where you might be able to help with productivity growth in allowing people to more easily move across state lines in professions where it's difficult to do so because of licensing barriers. Business tax reform, I think we'll get into, but I actually think is an area where we could improve productivity. Maybe less to do with the amount of revenue raised. I actually think it's less important to cut the amount of revenue raised from the business tax system so much as to rationalize it. And then I would also add, which we'll probably get to, healthcare reform, and just one important way to keep the labor force productive and participating is to keep them healthy.
So jumping off of Lily's sort of recommendation that maybe we focus on tax and then health, maybe that should be our next two topics. So again, just to repeat the line that that Trump had last night, which was, my economic team is developing historic tax reform that reduce the tax rate on companies, and then he says at the same time we'll provide massive tax relief for the middle class. So for this one, I think we'll, moving down the road, Jason maybe can kick us off here. Curious both what your view is of the Trump vision of tax reform, and to the degree you think it should be different, what should the vision for tax reform or tax changes be?
Sure. And I would just note that on this panel, we're doing it in the opposite order, that the president is actually doing his policies. And I think it is possible that when history looks back at the last 4 years, the decision to do the Affordable Care Act first will be judged a mistake and have lost the opportunity to do steps like taxes and infrastructure on a bipartisan basis. It's hard to talk about this because President Trump is running a rather unusual presidency in many respects. Probably not the least of which, although towards the lower end of which, is the fact that he's the first person since at least President Carter not to release a budget by September 28th or a budget framework. If you look back, everyone from Carter through Obama by this day would have had out a document.
By February?
By February 28th.
It's September.
Sorry, I meant for February 28th.
That would be hard.
No, he will definitely have one by September, I can tell you. Maybe two budgets.
Right. Correct. So won't have one. And the latest statements are that at least for a 5 or 10-year budget, I have heard that might not be until May. I'm not sure about that. And so it's a little bit hard to know what we're evaluating. Different people say different things. So in Congress, Speaker Ryan and the chair of the Ways and Means Committee have talked about revenue-neutral tax reform. The president has talked about a massive tax cut and a big, big tax cut. Those were two words that he used last night. It's a little bit hard to evaluate. I would say on the business side, if it is genuinely revenue neutral, I think that's a good conversation to have. I don't think our businesses are overtaxed. They're taxed at about the same rate on an effective basis as other major countries, but they're really stupidly taxed because we tax them at a high statutory rate, lots of loopholes, lots of different things. In different ways. So I think if it was genuinely revenue neutral, that would be a good conversation to have. There's this international proposal called Destination Basis Border Adjustment Cash Flow Tax, all sorts of acronyms around it. I think that's an idea that might be a good tax policy, a good way of administering the tax system and making sure you're not distorting the decisions companies make. I think it has a real logic to it. I think it has a set of really serious transition costs associated with movements in the exchange rate, what that would do to asset values, what other countries would do in response to our policy. Would they view it as a trade war? You know, I think that's something that's worth thinking about. I think for the foreseeable future, that thinking is better to take place in tax policy centers at NYU than it is in terms of actual legislation. I don't think we're close to being ready to legislate on that, but I don't think in principle that's a bad idea. In practice, I think it's quite risky. So I think there's potential. If this agenda, though, becomes subsumed in one that's about cutting taxes and massive tax cuts for individuals, and the plan put forward in the campaign, which was a massive tax cut for high-income individuals, first of all, I think it's doing the wrong thing to our distribution of income. It's skewing it up, not down. And second of all, any of these economic benefits of this type of tax reform, are there, but they're measured in the tenths of a percent. And the costs of the higher deficits are quite large. And a lot of the estimates that have looked at it have said, if you do these things and don't pay for them, you will do more harm to your economy through larger deficits than you do benefit through whatever tax cuts. So, revenue neutral, great, we can have a conversation. If it's really about losing revenue, and especially about losing revenue on high-income households, I think that would be a mistake economically and unwise from our priorities.
Sure. So I guess on taxes, we have a lot of people on the panel who are really obsessed with taxes, so we could probably spend the rest of the time talking about it. But to maybe back up, there's a couple just procedural ways that tax reform could happen. So one really important procedural issue affecting tax reform is the reconciliation process and whether both the president and both chambers of Congress decide to do tax reform on a bipartisan basis or not. So one possibility is that they go through something called the reconciliation process, which then means you don't need 60 votes in the Senate, and you can do tax reform then on a partisan basis, given who is in control of each branch of government right now. Yes, oh dear. I'll try to speed up. And the issue with the reconciliation process is that after 10 years, you cannot have any deficit increasing impact. So this is why the Bush tax cuts sunset after 10 years, but were large tax cuts during the first 10 years until they expired. The other possibility is to pass tax reform with 60 votes in the Senate, which would, of course, require Democrats. And I see several potential paths for how this can play out. I agree with Jason that given that healthcare repeal and replace has been prioritized ahead of tax reform, may mean that tax reform, at least as us nerds think of reform, falls by the wayside. But one possibility is a sort of full reform package that I think is done through the reconciliation process and has does not increase deficits after the first 10 years. And this is a little hard to square with the existing proposals that are out there because, for example, the House blueprint loses $3 trillion over the first 10 years and an even larger amount after that. The president's plan during the campaign lost over $6 trillion in the first 10 years and more after that. So you'd have to really retool those packages in order to have them be revenue neutral after the first 10 years. You could have much larger tax cuts in the first. And one point of tension, as Jason alluded to, is this destination-based cash flow tax that tax nerds have been talking about like crazy. And it has the virtue from this perspective of passing legislation that the international piece raises $1 trillion. It has the downside that that international piece is highly controversial. There does not seem to be a lot of support among Senate Republicans, let alone Senate Democrats.
Those aren't unrelated.
Yes. So it may be that idea, which I think is very intellectually interesting, may fall by the wayside. And I also personally have some concerns that it's not really ready for prime time in terms of passage, even though it's something worth continuing to explore in the long term. So a fallback option would be something that looks a little more like the Bush tax cuts and is a much simpler package that involves tax cuts but has no revenue impact outside the window and therefore sunsets. And that also means you can't really reform the international rules or do things that are like really upsetting the apple cart in terms of how the system works because you couldn't then sunset those at the end of 10 years. So then you could have something that looks like a lot of the rate cuts and other cuts that have been proposed both by the president and the House Republicans. Those, to date, I do not think abide by, what did the president say last night, that there'd be big, huge something tax cuts for the middle class?
Massive tax.
Massive tax
for the middle
cuts.
class and big was for corporations.
Okay. So they're not really massive for the middle class. The president's campaign proposal increases the after-tax income of people earning under $100,000 by about 1%, but it increases the after-tax income of people earning more than $1 million by 14%. So the existing proposals, and this is very similar to the House Republican blueprint, are really focused on the wealthy. It's possible that they fundamentally retool that distributional impact, but the proposals to date are not massive tax cuts for the middle class. And I did a paper this fall about how actually a lot of people in the middle class would see their taxes increased under Trump's campaign proposal because of certain ways that the policies work together.
I think that these are very interesting questions. I think that you have to know, first of all, that tax reform and health insurance reform are being worked on simultaneously. It is possible for the Trump White House to work on two issues simultaneously. And also visiting the House and Senate this week. They have different committees working on different things. There's a committee that certain staff is working on the Affordable Care Act repeal and replace, and certain of them working on tax reform, and they're different teams. So I want to just assure you that both of them are going on in parallel. Second, with tax reform, I think the main thing to know is that if you lower taxes, you have greater incentives to work. And yes, I agree with Jason and Lily that there are some cases when you look at it initially on paper where the upper income classes do benefit, but that's because the upper income classes pay most of the taxes. The top 1% pays 38% of all federal individual income taxes. The top 10% pays 73% of all federal individual income taxes. And the top half pays 97% of all federal individual income taxes. So it's practically impossible to have an individual tax cuts on the individual side rather than on the corporate side without unfairly or unduly disproportionately benefiting those who pay taxes. If that was your criteria, you would hardly have tax reform. However, one can put other things back into these tax reform mixes, such as refundable child care credits that phase out at certain income levels, so that transfers some of the income back. Lily mentioned the earned income tax credit. There are other mechanisms to do that. And these all come out of complex negotiations, first between the House and the Senate, and then with the White House. So in terms of the final tax package, I think everybody agrees that they want lower rates. In other words, the House leadership, the Senate leadership, and the president, but these have not yet been decided. Lower rates, in general, lead to higher economic growth. In terms of repeal of the Affordable Care Act, President Trump has already said that individuals do not have to provide proof of health insurance on their IRS forms. The way that the IRS was going to enforce the Obamacare mandate was by checking that people had health insurance with a line on your 1040. Now people do not have to fill this in. So basically, the mandate is practically unenforceable now. So that's one step that's already been taken. Second, he says he's going to waive the penalties for insurance companies that offer plans that are not compliant with the Affordable Care Act. Many plans, when President Obama said, if you like your plan, you can keep it, they were in fact not compliant with the provisions of the Affordable Care Act. Many of those were initially grandfathered, and then some more of them were grandfathered later on. And so what President Trump in essence has said is that if you start developing plans that do not meet the requirements, he's basically given a green light to do that. Why is that important? Because one of the problems with the Affordable Care Act is that it's biased in favor of people like me and against people like you, because the premium bands have to be 3-to-1. My premiums can be no more than 3 times the amount of your premiums. Before the Affordable Care Act, it was 5 times. So since, of course, the government did not want to lower my premiums, it raised your premiums, and that's one thing that's unfair about it. A second thing that's unfair about it is that people like you, everyone, is forced to buy an extremely generous plan that includes unlimited lifetime coverage, mental health coverage, drug abuse coverage. Many of you might not have children, but your plan has to include pediatric dental care. You might not be married, you might not want to have children right now, but the plan has to include maternity leave. That's one reason the plan is so expensive. People like you should be able to purchase a catastrophic health plan where you're insured against maybe getting cancer or falling off your bike in traffic, and not against just a routine cost of having a doctor's appointment, which is something you can pay for out of pocket. Insurance should be for unpredictable, large expenses. But under the Affordable Care Act, your checkup every year is covered. That's a predictable expense that you can cover yourself. But under, say, the Bronze Plan, you have to go through $5,000 of deductibles before being able to collect if you have something like heart surgery, which is an unpredictable expense. So it's really important that this is being dismantled, and it'll especially benefit people like you.
Can I just keep us on the topic of taxes and then go back to healthcare? I mean, I think that discussion of high-income taxes was in many ways interesting, because I think there are arguments for cutting taxes on net for high-income households. And when President Bush was running, candidate Bush in 2000 was running for president, he made them. And he made 2 arguments in particular, both of which Diana just made. One was he said these people are paying most of the taxes. They should get the money back. And in particular, he had the argument that no one should pay more than 1/3 of their income in federal taxes, so the top rate should go down to 33. He compromised and got it to 35. But it's sort of a moral argument about taxation. And the second is he made an economic argument. These are the job creators, these are the entrepreneurs. You give them a tax cut, and it will help people across the economy, more broadly. I have views on both of those that are somewhat different than President Bush, and Diana's views on both of those. But that's not what I want to litigate right now. What I wanted to point out is that is not
Litigated, because
the
we're in a law
argument-
school, right?
Exactly. That is not the argument that the administration is making. Secretary Mnuchin has said clearly, at least on 2 occasions, the Treasury Secretary, that any rate reductions for high-income households will be more than fully paid for by any cutbacks in loopholes and tax expenditures and other things for high-income households, and so that the plan will not be a net tax reduction for high-income households. So that's what the Secretary of the Treasury has said. As Lily pointed out, the campaign plan didn't have that feature, and so that's going to lead to one of 3 possibilities going forward. Either the plan will be revised, the Treasury Secretary will change how he talks about the plan, or they'll figure out how to get comfortable with a bit of a disparity between the 2. And I have my own bet as to which of those 3 is most likely. And the reason is because what Diana said is also exactly right on this. If you're doing tax reform with a lower top rate, there just aren't enough tax benefits going to people at the top to pay for that lower tax rate for people at the top. You can get it down a point or 2. You can't get it to something like 28 or 30 very easily. And so once you have decided the tax reform is going to have a lower tax rate on the top, you have decided you're going to have a tax cut for people at the top. And I think we should have an honest debate about that rather than the debate the political system's trying to have right now.
I just wanted to jump in on 2 more tax things, and I promised to stop talking tax. So one,
Otherwise, they'll leave.
on the sort of question of how, whether you can make the tax code more progressive or have tax cuts focused on the middle class, I think that's certainly possible. So Diana talked about how the higher income people pay the vast majority of income tax, which is certainly true. It's different with payroll tax. But the statistics I was quoting, or estimates of Trump's campaign proposals, were about the change as a share of income for each income group. So it was, the tax cuts for millionaires were 14% of their income, and for the bottom 50% or something, they were 1% of their income. So you certainly could structure a plan that made that a 5% boost for the bottom 50% and a 1% boost for the millionaires. And that's not what the president's campaign proposal has done, and sort of query whether that's going to change. The other point I wanted issue on to get into was the committee dynamics here. And Diana alluded to, the president and Congress are certainly capable of working on two issues. And here I just want to jump in because I worked on the Hill for 4 years. And talk about how I have some sympathy for all of them in trying to work on both these issues at once, because they are massive issues, both tax reform and healthcare reform, that take multiple years to work on. And I actually don't think it's terribly realistic to do them both in 1 year, let alone both in 6 months. So they are, there is a different staffer generally to cover health tax than to cover, for example, business tax reform. But that's actually all the Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, and then half of healthcare reform is tax. And so it's the tax teams within there that have maybe 5 staffers total. And they rely on the Joint Committee on Taxation, and they rely on these ledge council geniuses who draft all legislation. And there's maybe 3 people in the Senate and 3 people in the House that know how to do the actual legislative drafting, which just takes hours and hours. So, the just sort of practical, I think we actually should fund more congressional staffers, but given how few we have, I think it's hard to imagine just drafting these bills in the timelines that have been outlined so far. And I thought one interesting thing about the president's address last night, and maybe I missed this, was it seemed to not talk about quite as aggressive timelines as he has at some points in the past, in terms of, we're going to repeal and replace Obamacare within a month or something.
So,
Yeah, and just briefly, in 2015, Senator McConnell, Leader McConnell, and President Obama both wanted to work together on Trade Promotion Authority and on business tax reform. Those were both in the same committee. It took, over a year to do the trade one, at which time you had run out the clock. 2009 and 10, we made really ruthless choices about prioritizing, and would have loved to have done an infrastructure bill in those 2 years, but the president put Affordable Care Act, financial reform, and then something that didn't pass, a cap and trade system for our energy, and the Recovery Act ahead of that online, and just time ran out on getting things done. So you need to prioritize, and the order you do things matters.
It's also very hard to do things in an election year, so things really need to be done this year. It's much harder to pass legislation in an election year, which is going to be next year.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to make sure that we have time for some student questions. I'm hoping that we can return to the topic of healthcare reform, but we'll see what people want to talk about. But since we have 15 minutes left, I just want to be sure that folks get a chance to ask their own questions, and not just me. And I think we'll wait for the mic until to speak. So did I see a hand over here?
Hi. I guess I should preface this by saying if you look at the productivity statistics, maybe this issue is a little overblown. But it's almost cliche to bring it up at this point. It's everywhere. But automation, and if you look at estimates right now, there's set to be about 1.5 million truck drivers and taxi drivers who are going to probably lose their jobs within the next 10 years if the technologists are right. And at the same time, it seems that it's cliche. You don't hear Democrats or Republicans really talking about it. And from my sense of the economics literature is that job retraining programs don't really work. And even though that's sort of the safe political thing to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, and do you have any ideas what we should do if we do lose a lot of jobs due to automation?
Well, as I said before, the level of education of the workforce is extremely important. We have had automation in different sectors before. At the end of the 1700s, a very large share of Americans were employed in agriculture. And there were Luddites who went and destroyed farm machines because they thought it was going to destroy jobs. Now, fewer than 2% of Americans are employed in agriculture, but we make enough food to feed the whole world, and people who would have been farmers have other jobs. When we have seen these different waves of technology, such as the Industrial Revolution, we have seen productivity rise, we have seen other jobs created afterwards. And I don't know what those jobs are going to be, but I have no doubt that those jobs are going to occur. But we do need a better level of education to enable people to have those jobs. So I myself am not worried about the automation and the robots. Many of the jobs that they're going to be taking are very boring jobs, and people would be able to find more interesting ones afterwards. But I think retraining is best done on the employer level. You have to have a certain set of skills for your employer to be able to train you to do the job that she wants you to do.
Jason?
I gave a whole speech on this topic a few blocks away from here called, I think, Is This Time Different? And Rob Siemens, who's at the Stern School, faculty at the Stern School, did a lot of work on this topic when he was at the Council of Economic Advisors, so you could take a look at that. I think I broadly agree with what Diana just said. Would add two important caveats. One, if you look at what jobs are threatened by automation, they are disproportionately low-wage jobs. In some ways, that's good for us as a society because these aren't particularly pleasant jobs, but that's the same thing that's been causing inequality for decades. And so one reason why it doesn't cause massive job loss is because people's wages go down and they keep working, but they keep working at a lower wage. So there's this inequality issue. And then second, the thing I was saying before, you look at the labor force participation rate for men has been declining from the 50s to the present. So you don't have mass technological unemployment, but we have done a less good job in the United States of placing people into jobs. And we've done a less good job compared to other places. If you look across countries, it's not that places with lots of technology have lots of unemployment. You don't see any relationship between the level of technology and the level of unemployment. But you see big differences in those employment rates across countries, and I think that reflects institutional choices. I think one of those actually is things like training programs. There's a lot of them that don't work. There's a number of them that do. We spend very little in that area, 0.2% of GDP. Denmark spends 2% of its GDP. No one else in the OECD spends less than us, than Mexico and Chile. So I do think that helping labor markets function with training, job search assistance, apprenticeship, et cetera, is part of the answer too.
Hi, thank you. Can you talk about the economic impact of the infrastructure plans that have been talked about, and maybe how that economic impact is different from what would have happened if we would have done infrastructure investment in 2008 after the recession, or like in the middle of the recession, and under a democratic program? And then maybe, if there's time, are we drawing down some of the infrastructure investments that we would have for another future recession by doing it now?
We
Yeah.
might, oh, sorry, were you?
I'll jump in,
Yeah, go
but
ahead.
you probably have much more to say. There's a little bit of uncertainty about what infrastructure investments would be under this administration. The president has talked about stimulating $1 trillion of infrastructure investment, and it appears from some stuff that his campaign put out he referenced public-private partnerships last night, that this may be primarily through tax credits to subsidize public-private partnerships in infrastructure investment. This is very different from the model of increasing funding, federal funding for example, the Highway Trust Fund, which also funds mass transit and other investments. And the issue is that a public-private partnership only works when there's a revenue stream generated from the infrastructure investment. And currently, you can't toll interstate highways. There are a lot of infrastructure investments that don't generate that revenue stream, so they aren't really viable for that public-private investment option. And then there's also questions of what tax nerds would call buying out the base, and whether you're giving tax credits to partnerships that would happen anyhow. So that's sort of one issue, I think, with the infrastructure proposals as a substantive matter, that they may end up not inducing as much new infrastructure investment as the president might hope, and that it might be projects that are already more viable from a revenue perspective and therefore potentially less needed from a societal perspective. For example, if you need rural roads for access, that's not necessarily going to be a great revenue generator. I also thought it was interesting that the president mentioned this in the address last night, because I do think it's one area of tension with congressional Republicans, where there was a infrastructure package passed, I guess it was probably close to 2 years ago now, that funded the Highway Trust Fund for at least 5 years. And the general view among congressional Republicans has been, we did that, this is off the legislative agenda until it needs to be reauthorized again. So I do think that was one area, along with potentially the child care and paid leave proposals that the president mentioned, where he's a little out of sync with congressional Republicans in terms of what should be top priorities.
Well, there is definitely a focus on the private sector rebuilding infrastructure, and Donald Trump has sometimes given the old post office pavilion as an example. It was being underutilized. It's on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., between the White House and Congress, and his company turned it into a hotel with rooms that now go for around $700 a night. So it's now a productive asset. So there are many regulations that can be rolled back that would encourage people to invest in different types of infrastructure. This is not just roads and bridges, although there are companies who want to build and invest in roads and bridges and airports. If you look at airports in the United States, they're primarily government-owned. If you look at them in Britain and other parts of the world, they are owned by holding companies. They're privately owned, and a lot more money flows into them. There's also pipelines, there's water systems. Many pipeline applications have been blocked. There are many people who want to build pipelines. The two most obvious ones are Keystone XL and the Dakota Access Pipeline, but there are other pipelines also. So President Trump has also talked about rolling back some of these regulations to enable the private sector to do more investment in infrastructure. In his book, called Crippled America, he said giving politicians $1 trillion to spend on infrastructure is a recipe for disaster. So he definitely has other plans for it, built on his experience as a developer.
Jason?
I'm happy to get more questions.
Okay, great.
Hi, thanks for being here. One area of costs that I think is especially significant to us law students is the cost of higher education. And it's kind of incredible if you look at the numbers, how much that's gone up over the past few decades. And I know that that's often sort of beyond, especially the federal government's control, but I was wondering if you could talk about what can be done to address the cost of higher education.
Sure, and my latest book, which is called Disinherited: How Washington is Betraying America's Young, that came out a couple of years ago, has a chapter on student debt. And one contributing factor is the ease of being able to get federal student loans. And I'm sure my fellow panelists are going to disagree with me. But studies show that when students can more easily get loans, the institutions then pass it on by jacking up the prices, and that this is one contributory factor. So I would suggest that this is an area the federal government does not have to be in, that if there were private institutions lending money, they would pay a lot more attention to the value of a degree. They might not automatically lend the money. They might say, if you're a C student and you want to major in anthropology and you don't have a chance of getting a job afterwards, maybe you should be looking at some other kind of degree. I've done research on how C students can get well-paying jobs using a data set from Florida that joined education and earnings from unemployment insurance records. And for C students, a community college degree in a high-return field, such as one of the healthcare services or computer programming, can pay $45,000 afterwards. People can earn $45,000 afterwards, and it only costs $3,000 a year to go to community college. So I think there needs to be more competition in the student loan business. I think people should look at alternatives such as community college, either getting an associate degree or using that to transfer to a four-year institution at practically half the cost. This is a very serious problem, not just for all of you who have graduated and have your BA, but for people who get these college loans and then don't graduate. So they're stuck with the college loan and no degree. And it's very, very difficult for them to get out of this particular trap. So it's really something that needs to be looked at.
Jason.
I think, for the median student, debt is not a serious issue. The extra return you get from college vastly exceeds the extra interest you have to pay on your debt. What worries me is the people for whom college doesn't work out because of bad choices or bad circumstances. And so something we did in the Obama administration was expanded income-based repayment, that if repayments were more than 10% of your income, you could defer your debt, and then after a period, I think 25 years, your debt would get forgiven. A lot more people are enrolled in that now than before, but it's still somewhat complicated. And in Australia, they do it in a really easy manner. Just through your tax return, they collect a bit of money based on your earnings. Once your debt is extinguished, they stop collecting that. And if your debt isn't extinguished after a certain amount of time, it's forgiven. So I think something like that that's focused less on the median student for whom college is a great investment, and we as a society shouldn't be, I think, subsidizing someone's private gains in that way, and more on the tails. The other part of the tails is that people have run into real problems with repayment tend to be people that go to, crappy schools and don't finish them. And a lot of those are in the for-profit sector. We did a set of regulations in that sector, all the ones you see advertised on the subway, that were designed to bring regulations. And again, you can debate all the details of that. But I think if you rolled those back, you'd see an increase in, you'd see defaults increasing again, just like they were a few years ago.
There is a problem with the unpaid student loan debt from these repayment programs that is growing and being held by the federal government. And some people say that the Department of Education is just basically $1 trillion bank that's managing this loan portfolio. So these repayment schemes where you can go to school, you can work, you can get your law degree, you can borrow $200,000 after 10 years of working in a nonprofit, the rest of the debt vanishes. That is actually problematic for the taxpayer. So someone who has not had the advantage of that law school education is left paying in terms of additions to the national debt. So there are problems with the repayment.
Which is why, fortunately, when we legislated this in 2010, we actually factored in those costs in the future, figured out what they would cost in the present, and made sure it was fully paid for as part of the legislation that passed that. And CBO certified that legislation would not add to the debt, not just in this decade, but in any future decade either. So that's a real issue, but it's one we took into account.
Of course it's adding to the debt. You have to admit that the debt added to it is bigger than what was forecast.
No, I'm happy to refer you back to, we took that issue very seriously and went through the numbers on it, and
I'll go back and check the numbers.
All right. So on that, so there, as we can tell, I want to thank the panelists for a great discussion today, covering a range of issues. And,